The evening air was crisp and unusually still as the group of UFO researchers gathered at the edge of Ravenswood Forest. Known for its eerie silences and inexplicable lights in the sky, the forest had long been a hot spot for those who believed that humanity was not alone. This particular group, calling themselves the Cosmic Seekers, had spent years poring over blurry photographs, declassified government files, and first-hand accounts of extraterrestrial encounters. Tonight, they had set up camp for what they hoped would be a night to remember. The group consisted of 6 individuals, each driven by their own reasons for joining the vigil. There was Dr. Lila Grant, an astrophysicist turned skeptic whose sharp mind often clashed with her innate curiosity. Beside her sat Jake, a conspiracy theorist with an impressive collection of alien abduction stories and a flair for drama. Anna, a local journalist, meticulously took notes while maintaining a healthy dose of cynicism. The youngest member, Alex, was a tech whiz who had built the group's signal detection device. Rounding out the group were Victor and Elaine, a married couple whose shared passion for the unknown had reignited their strained relationship. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of deep orange and purple, the group began their preparations. Alex fiddled with his equipment, muttering to himself about signal calibration. Lila stared at the treetops, her thoughts wandering between science and the strange accounts that had brought her here. Jake was already holding court, regaling Anna with tales of UFO sightings he swore were the real deal. When darkness fell, the atmosphere shifted. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the faint hum of Alex's device. A large campfire crackled in the center of their circle, its light dancing across their faces. So, Jake began, his voice low and theatrical. "What do you think they'll look like if they show up tonight? Little gray guys? Or maybe something we can't even comprehend?" Anna rolled her eyes, but humored him. "If they exist, and I'm not saying they do, why would they come here? Ravenswood is the middle of nowhere. They're drawn to places like this," Victor chimed in. "Isolation, natural energy sources, the kind of place humans avoid after dark." "Humans avoid it because of the legends," Lila interjected. "Ghost stories and folklore passed down for generations. It doesn't mean there's any truth to it." Just as she finished speaking, Alex's device emitted a soft beep. Everyone froze. "It's probably nothing," Alex said quickly, adjusting the dials. But his furrowed brow suggested otherwise. "There's a faint signal, could be interference from a satellite or... Jake pressed, leaning forward eagerly. "Or something else," Alex admitted reluctantly. The group fell silent, their eyes scanning the star-filled sky. Time seemed to stretch as they sat in anticipation. Minutes passed, then an hour. The signal persisted, growing stronger at irregular intervals, but there was no sign of movement above. The tension was palpable, each member of the group battling their own thoughts about what might or might not be out there. By midnight, the mood had shifted again. Exhaustion and disappointment began to set in. Elaine suggested they take turns keeping watch while the others rested. As the group reluctantly agreed, Alex adjusted the equipment one last time before stepping away from the fire to check his phone. And then the silence was broken, not by the hum of the device or the crackle of the fire, but by a distant sound, low and mournful, that seemed to echo from deep within the forest. It wasn't a natural sound. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was something else. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Did anyone hear that?" Victor whispered. "Yeah," Lila replied, her voice barely audible. It sounded wrong. For the first time that night, the Cosmic Seekers found themselves questioning whether they were truly prepared for what they might discover in Ravenswood. The group sat frozen in place, their eyes darting toward the dense expanse of trees that surrounded their camp. The strange sound, low, mournful, and faintly metallic, hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. Even the crackling fire seemed subdued, its flickering flames offering little comfort. Lila was the first to break the silence. "It's probably an animal," she said, though her voice wavered, betraying her unease. "An animal?" Jake scoffed. "What kind of animal makes a sound like that?" He gestured toward the woods. "That was not from here." Victor stood, and adjusted his flashlight. Let's not jump to conclusions. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Sounds carry differently in places like this. His words were calm, but the tremor in his hand as he held the flashlight didn't go unnoticed. Elaine touched his arm gently. Maybe we should just stay together. Whatever it is, it's probably best not to go looking for it. Alex, still seated by his equipment, squinted at the monitor. The signal changed, he said, his voice quiet but urgent. The others turned to him, their attention snapping away from the forest. It's stronger now, and different, almost like it's reacting to something. Reacting to what? Anna asked, her pen hovering above her notebook. Alex hesitated, then pointed toward the woods. It's coming from there. A heavy silence followed his words, each member of the group processing the implications. Jake, ever the thrill seeker, was the first to rise. Well, if it's coming from the woods, that's where we need to go. That's ridiculous, Lila snapped, standing as well. We don't even know what we're dealing with. For all we know, it could be a bear, or worse, a person trying to lure us in, or it could be what we came here for. Jake countered, a gleam of excitement in his eyes. Isn't this what we're all here to find? Proof. Victor sighed and turned to Elaine. What do you think? Should we check it out? Elaine hesitated, her gaze shifting between the dark woods and the group. I don't like it, she admitted. But if we're going to do this, we stick together. No one wanders off. Reluctantly, the group agreed. Alex grabbed a portable monitor connected to his equipment. Jake armed himself with a sturdy flashlight, and Anna kept her notebook and pen in hand. Lila insisted on bringing a flare gun she had packed just in case, though she hoped she wouldn't need it. As they ventured into the woods, the firelight behind them grew faint, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The forest was unnaturally quiet, as if every living creature had fled. The group's footsteps crunched on the brittle leaves, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. The signal grew stronger as they walked, the monitor emitting a steady beeping that quickened with each step. It's like we're closing in on something, Alex said, his voice tinged with a mix of awe and fear. What's that up ahead? Elaine whispered, pointing to a faint glow in the distance. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there, a pale, bluish light emanating from deeper within the woods. The group exchanged uneasy glances before pressing on. The glow grew brighter as they approached, until they found themselves standing at the edge of a small clearing. In the center was an object that defied explanation. It was roughly the size of a car, its surface smooth and reflective, like liquid metal frozen in time. The pale blue light emanated from faint lines etched into its surface, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The air around it felt thick, almost electric, and the hairs on their arms stood on end. What the hell is that? Anna breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. For the first time, even Jake was at a loss for words. Lila stepped forward cautiously, her scientific instincts battling her fear. It's not natural, she said, reaching out as if to touch the object before pulling her hand back at the last second. Before anyone could respond, the low, mournful sound from earlier echoed through the woods again. Only this time, it was louder and closer. The group turned as one, their flashlights scanning the trees. The light from the object flickered, and the monitor in Alex's hands began to emit a high-pitched whine. And then, without warning, the blue light vanished, plunging the clearing into darkness. Darkness enveloped the group, swallowing the clearing and its mysterious object in an instant. The abrupt extinguishing of the bluish light left them momentarily blinded, their flashlights too weak to pierce the void. Panic rippled through the group as the high-pitched whine from Alex's monitor reached an ear-splitting crescendo before abruptly cutting off. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to press against their ears. What just happened? Anna's voice trembled, her usual composure giving way to fear. She clutched her notebook like a shield. I don't know, Alex stammered, frantically tapping at the now lifeless monitor. It just died. Everything died. Not everything, Jake muttered, his flashlight scanning the treetops. I think whatever made that noise is still out there. The group instinctively huddled closer, their backs to one another as they scanned their surroundings. The oppressive darkness seemed alive, shifting and whispering just beyond the reach of their lights. Elaine tightened her grip on Victor's arm, her breathing shallow. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't just leave," Lila argued, though her tone betrayed her own fear. "That thing, it's proof. We need to document it, study it. There's nothing to document." Jake snapped, his bravado beginning to crack. "It's gone, Lila. Whatever it was, it's gone. And we should be too." Before anyone could respond, a faint light flickered in the distance, deeper within the forest. It wasn't the same pale blue glow they had seen before. This was harsher, more erratic, like a flame struggling to survive. The group stared at it, frozen. "What is that?" Elaine asked, her voice trembling. "It could be another part of the object," Alex suggested, though his uncertainty was clear. "Or something else entirely. Or someone," Victor said grimly. The group debated for a tense moment, but curiosity and the faint hope of finding answers won out. Slowly, they began making their way toward the flickering light, their flashlights trembling in unsteady hands. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself resisted their progress. When they reached the source of the light, they found a small lantern hanging from a low branch. Its flame sputtered weakly, casting jagged shadows across the ground. Below the lantern lay a scattering of objects, a rusted compass, a tattered map, and a small notebook with pages worn thin from time and use. "What is this?" Anna asked, kneeling to inspect the items. She opened the notebook carefully, her flashlight revealing hastily scrawled notes and drawings. "These are sightings. Dates, locations, descriptions of lights in the sky. Someone else has been out here," Victor said, his voice low. "Someone like us? But where are they now?" Jake asked, glancing nervously over his shoulder. As if in answer, the mournful sound from earlier rang out again, louder and more resonant than before. This time, it seemed to come from multiple directions, echoing through the trees like a chorus. The group froze, their eyes darting around wildly. And then, faintly, they saw them, shapes moving through the darkness. They weren't human. Their forms were indistinct, shadowy, and they seemed to ripple like heat waves in the air. Lila's breath caught in her throat. "Run," she whispered. No one needed further convincing. They bolted back toward the direction of the camp, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they dodged branches and stumbled over roots. The sound grew louder, almost deafening, as if it were chasing them. When they finally burst into the clearing where their fire had been, they found it extinguished. The equipment was overturned, their belongings scattered. It was as if a storm had torn through their camp. "What the hell is happening?" Alex shouted, his voice cracking. Before anyone could answer, the forest erupted in light. A beam, impossibly bright and blinding, shot down from the sky, illuminating the clearing. The group shielded their eyes, their screams lost in the roar of the beam. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the light vanished. The group was left in silence once more, their breaths ragged, their minds reeling. Whatever had just happened, one thing was clear. They were no longer alone in Ravenswood Forest. The group stood paralyzed in the aftermath of the blinding light, their breaths shallow and erratic. The air in the clearing felt charged, as though an electrical storm had passed through. Alex broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Did anyone else feel that?" "Feel what?" Jake asked, his tone laced with anger and fear. "The heat," Alex replied. "When the light hit, it wasn't just bright, it was hot, like it was burning through the air." Victor scanned the clearing with his flashlight, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the wreckage of their camp. Whatever it wasn't natural. This wasn't just a coincidence. Elaine knelt near the extinguished fire pit, her fingers brushing over the ash. She frowned, holding up her hand to reveal a faint residue of a silvery powder. "What is this?" she murmured. The powder shimmered faintly in the weak light of her flashlight, as if alive. "Don't touch it," Lila barked, pulling Elaine back. "We don't know what that is. It could be dangerous." "It was everywhere in the light," Elaine said, her voice trembling. "I saw it swirling, almost like it was part of the beam. Anna crouched next to her and opened her notebook. We need to record this. Every detail. Whatever's happening here, we can't afford to forget it. Or worse, let it disappear without a trace. As the group began cautiously cataloging the remnants of their camp, Alex's attention was drawn to a tree at the edge of the clearing. The bark had been stripped away in long, jagged lines, revealing deep gouges beneath. The marks were symmetrical and oddly precise, as though carved by a machine. "Hey, over here," he called out, waving the others over. The group gathered around the tree, their flashlights illuminating the markings. The pattern was intricate, almost geometric, and pulsated faintly as though alive. Lila stepped closer, her scientific curiosity overriding her fear. "This isn't random," she said, running her fingers near, but not on, the markings. "This looks like a message. Or a map." "A map to what?" Jake asked, his frustration evident. "I don't know," Lila admitted, "but these lines, they remind me of star charts." "Look, these intersecting points could be constellations." Victor frowned, his gaze fixed on the pulsating glow. "If it's a map, it's not for us. Whoever or whatever left this wasn't trying to guide humans." As they deliberated, a sudden rustling sound came from the forest. The group froze, their flashlights darting toward the noise. The sound grew louder, closer, and more deliberate. It wasn't the erratic movement of an animal. It was rhythmic, as though something, or someone, was walking toward them. "Stay together," Victor whispered, gripping a makeshift club he'd fashioned from a broken tent pole. From the shadows emerged a figure, human in shape but distinctly wrong. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its body shrouded in a faint, silvery mist. Its head tilted unervingly as if studying them, and a low, vibrating hum emanated from its chest. The group stepped back in unison, their collective fear palpable. "What is that?" Anna whispered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, the figure raised a hand, its fingers elongating into tendrils of light that rippled through the air. The group shielded their eyes as the brightness intensified and the hum grew louder, resonating deep within their skulls. And then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into the mist, leaving behind only a faint outline of its form etched into the grass. "What the hell is happening?" Jake demanded, his voice breaking. "No one move," Lila said firmly, her eyes fixed on the outline. She crouched down and examined it closely. "This isn't just an impression in the grass. It's burned in like a brand." Alex checked his monitor again, only to find it still lifeless. "We need answers," he said, his voice steadier now. "We can't keep running blind. Whatever this is trying to tell us something, or warn us." As the group regrouped, their minds raced with questions. They had come to Ravenswood Forest seeking evidence of extraterrestrial activity, but what they had found was far beyond their comprehension. The air around them felt heavier, charged with an unspoken promise that the night was far from over. "Pack what's left," Victor said, his voice resolute. "We're staying. Whatever's happening here, it's not finished with us yet." And as the group reluctantly agreed, the faint glow of the tree markings seemed to grow brighter, as if acknowledging their decision. As the remnants of their camp were hastily packed, the group moved with a mix of purpose and dread. The strange events that had unfolded in Ravenswood Forest weighed heavily on their minds, and their collective silence was only broken by the occasional snap of a branch underfoot or the whispered rustle of leaves in the wind. Victor led the way back to the tree with the glowing carvings, his determination a thin veneer over his own unease. "We need to focus on the markings," Lila said, clutching her notebook tightly. "If they're a message or a map, they might explain everything." Jake snorted. "Explain what?" "Why shadow creatures are stalking us. Why our camp got destroyed. Face it, this isn't some riddle we can solve with star charts." Alex interrupted their bickering, holding up the monitor he had been troubleshooting since it went dead. "It just powered back on," he said, his voice filled with equal parts relief and worry. "But look at this." The screen displayed nothing but static at first. Then, faintly, patterns began to emerge. lines and shapes that seemed to mirror the carvings on the tree. Alongside them, an audio feed crackled to life, emitting a low, hollow frequency that sent shivers down their spines. "That sound," Anna whispered, her eyes wide. "It's the same one we heard earlier." "It's not random," Alex said, his fingers flying over the controls. "It's repeating in intervals, like a signal. Someone or something is broadcasting this." Elaine, who had been nervously scanning their surroundings, froze. "Broadcasting it to who?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet trembled. It wasn't an earthquake. This was different, localized, as though the forest floor itself were alive. The tree with the carvings pulsed brightly, the glow radiating out in concentric circles that illuminated the ground like ripples in a pond. The group staggered back as a loud crack split the air. The tree's trunk seemed to fold inward, its wood peeling back to reveal a hollow core. Within it was a cylindrical device, metallic and alien in design. It hummed with the same frequency as the monitor, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe under their gaze. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice breaking. "It's a beacon," Lila said breathlessly. "Or a transmitter. This whole forest, it's not just a hot spot for activity. It's a node, a connection point." Before the implications could sink in, the device began to emit beams of light in random directions. One beam struck the monitor Alex held, causing the screen to flicker wildly before stabilizing. A new image appeared, a map of the forest overlaid with glowing points of light. "That's us," Alex said, pointing to one of the glowing dots near the center of the map. "But what are the others?" Anna asked, her voice trembling. As if in response, the device emitted a sudden, sharp pulse. The lights on the map began to move toward their location. "They're coming," Elaine said, backing away from the beacon. "Whatever those dots represent, they're coming for us." The group erupted into chaos, voices overlapping in panic. Victor tried to assert control, his tone commanding. "We need to move. Now. We can't stay here." "Move where?" Jake snapped. "Every direction leads deeper into this nightmare." "Anywhere but here," Victor said firmly, grabbing his gear. Before they could make a decision, the first of the dots arrived. From the darkness emerged another figure, similar to the one they had seen earlier, but larger, more defined. Its form was almost crystalline, its body refracting light into a kaleidoscope of colors. It moved with an eerie grace, its head tilting as it observed them. The group froze, unsure whether to run or stay. The figure raised an arm, and a beam of light shot out, striking the beacon. The device responded with a high-pitched whine, its symbols glowing brighter as if in protest. "This isn't random," Lila said, her voice shaking. "It's communicating with it, or trying to stop it." As the group watched in stunned silence, more figures began to emerge, each one unique in shape and movement. They surrounded the clearing, their attention focused solely on the beacon. "This is our chance," Victor said, his voice low. "While they're distracted, we need to get out of here." Reluctantly, the group began to retreat, their movements slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. As they disappeared into the forest, the last thing they saw was the beacon erupting in a cascade of light, its hum rising to an ear-splitting crescendo. The forest fell silent once more, but the group knew they were far from safe. Whatever forces were at play in Ravenswood Forest, they were now part of the unfolding mystery, a mystery that seemed determined to follow them wherever they went. The group's frantic retreat from the clearing quickly devolved into disarray as the forest seemed to shift around them. Trees appeared closer together, their gnarled branches intertwining like skeletal hands, forming a labyrinth where paths twisted into new configurations with each step. The once familiar terrain of Ravenswood Forest now felt like an alien landscape designed to trap them. "Does anyone know where we're going?" Jake hissed, his flashlight sweeping erratically over the dense underbrush. Victor paused, consulting his map and compass, but the tools seemed useless. The compass needle spun wildly, unable to lock onto any direction. "Just keep moving," he said tersely, his confidence visibly cracking. "What if we're going in circles?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling. What if the forest is alive? Stop it, Lila snapped, though her own fear was evident. We need to stay rational. There has to be a way out. Alex, carrying the monitor that had displayed the cryptic map earlier, suddenly halted. Wait, he said, staring at the screen. The map was still active, but the glowing dots representing the figures had multiplied, swarming like fireflies. They're spreading. They're everywhere. Great, Jake muttered. We're running blind, and the forest is crawling with whatever they are. As the group argued, a deep, guttural sound echoed through the trees. It wasn't the metallic hum they had heard before, but something organic, primal. The noise seemed to vibrate through their chests, making their skin crawl. Did you hear that? Elaine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They all nodded, frozen in place. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by the distinct crunch of leaves. Panic surged as they realized they were no longer alone. Move! Victor barked, taking the lead once more. The group plunged deeper into the forest, their movements frantic. The oppressive darkness swallowed them, their flashlights providing little comfort against the vast unknown. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing, a small break in the forest where the moonlight illuminated something peculiar. In the center of the space stood an ancient stone structure, weathered and overgrown with moss. It resembled an altar, its surface carved with symbols eerily similar to those on the beacon. What is this? Lila asked, approaching cautiously. It's a waypoint, Alex said, scanning the symbols with his monitor. It's connected to the beacon, or maybe even the entire forest. Look at the carvings. They're a continuation of the message. Before they could analyze further, the guttural sound returned, louder and more menacing. From the shadows, a figure emerged. A towering entity unlike the crystalline forms they had encountered earlier. This creature was cloaked in darkness, its form barely discernible except for its glowing, amber eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. Back away, Victor whispered, motioning for the group to retreat. But the creature made no move to attack. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying them. The group stood frozen, the weight of its gaze paralyzing. Then, it raised an elongated limb and pointed toward the altar. What does it want? Anna asked, her voice shaking. I think it wants us to activate something, Alex said, stepping closer to the structure despite the others' protests. His fingers brushed over the carvings, and the altar began to hum softly. The symbols lit up, forming intricate patterns that pulsed in time with the monitor's hollow frequency. The creature emitted a low growl, its eyes narrowing. Alex hesitated, but Victor urged him on. Do it. Whatever this is, it's the only lead we've got. As Alex completed the sequence, the altar emitted a beam of light that shot straight into the sky, piercing through the canopy of trees. The forest around them seemed to shudder, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The creature let out a deafening roar, but instead of attacking, it retreated into the shadows, its form dissolving into the darkness. The group watched in stunned silence as the altar continued to hum, the light beam pulsating like a heartbeat. What just happened? Jake asked, his voice barely audible. I think we've triggered something, Lila said, her face pale. Something bigger than we understand. As the light from the altar illuminated the surrounding trees, the group realized the forest was no longer quiet. The guttural sounds and metallic hums were merging into a chorus, growing louder with each passing moment. Whatever they had awakened, it was far from over. The beam of light emanating from the altar was unrelenting, slicing through the darkness of Ravenswood Forest like a celestial blade. It illuminated the surroundings with an eerie clarity, revealing details that might otherwise have remained hidden. Ancient carvings on nearby rocks, unnatural patterns in the forest floor, and fleeting movements in the trees. The group huddled near the altar, unsure whether to stay or flee, as the humming sound grew louder and more oppressive. What did we just activate? Elaine asked, her voice trembling. She kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting the shadowy figure to re-emerge. I don't know, Alex admitted, his hands still resting on the glowing carvings. But it feels like this altar is connected to everything we've encountered. The beacon, the forest, those things, whatever it is, we've painted a giant target on ourselves, Jake said, motioning to the beam of light. This thing is a beacon now. We're sitting ducks. Lila shook her head, her mind racing. No, this isn't just a signal. It's a guide. She pointed to the shifting patterns of light on the ground, which had formed into what looked like a trail leading away from the clearing. The symbols, they're forming a path. I think we're supposed to follow it. Victor hesitated, torn between the danger of staying and the uncertainty of following an unknown path. If this is a guide, he said, it might lead us to answers. But we need to move carefully. Whatever's out there isn't going to just let us walk away. With no other options, the group began their cautious journey along the illuminated path. The light seemed to carve through the forest like a living thing, bending and twisting as if it had a mind of its own. It wasn't a straight path. It wove through dense clusters of trees and over uneven terrain, forcing the group to remain vigilant. As they walked, the forest seemed to react to their presence. The trees groaned as if under strain, their branches reaching downward like grasping fingers. Strange noises echoed around them, clicking, chittering, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Is it just me, or is the forest watching us? Anna asked, her voice barely audible. It's not just you, Victor replied grimly, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. After an hour of following the path, they came to another clearing. At its center was a massive, gnarled tree, its roots sprawling across the ground like veins. The tree's bark was etched with more of the alien symbols, but these were different, more intricate and chaotic, as if the language itself had been corrupted. This has to be another waypoint, Alex said, studying the monitor, which was flickering erratically. But the signal here, it's unstable. Stronger, but it's almost like it's fighting itself. As they approached the tree, the air grew thick, and a low vibration pulsed through the ground. Lila reached out to touch the bark, but before her hand could make contact, the tree erupted with light. The group staggered back as the symbols glowed brightly, projecting images into the air like holograms. The images were chaotic, blurry, disjointed fragments that seemed to tell a story. A vast alien structure rose from the earth, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. Strange beings moved around it, their forms constantly shifting. Then, darkness fell, and the structure crumbled into ruins, consumed by shadowy figures that looked eerily familiar. This is a warning, Lila said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. Whatever was here before, something destroyed it, something tied to those shadows. Before anyone could respond, the tree let out a deafening crack, its roots pulling away from the ground. The clearing began to collapse, the earth splitting into jagged chasms. "Run!" Victor shouted, grabbing Anna's arm as the group scrambled to escape the sinking ground. They barely made it to solid ground before the clearing collapsed entirely, leaving behind a gaping void where the tree had stood. The glowing path reappeared, leading away from the destruction and deeper into the forest. Breathing heavily, Jake looked back at the void. "This isn't a guide," he said bitterly. "It's a trap. Every step we take, this place pulls us in deeper." "But why?" Elaine asked. "Why lead us anywhere at all? Why not just kill us?" Lila stared at the glowing path, her mind racing. "Maybe it's not leading us to safety," she said slowly. "Maybe it's leading us to something that needs us to finish what it started." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but knew they had no choice. The path beckoned, and whatever lay at its end, they were now irrevocably part of it. With every step, the mystery of Ravenswood Forest deepened, pulling them further into its labyrinth of light and shadow. As the group followed the glowing path deeper into Ravenswood Forest, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to tighten its grip. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness descended, broken only by the faint rustling of unseen movements in the shadows. The beam of light, once a beacon of clarity, now felt more like a leash pulling them toward an unknown fate. What if this path isn't leading us out, Elaine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced nervously at the trees, their twisted forms seeming to lean closer with every step. "It's not," Lila replied firmly. "It's leading us in, but we don't have a choice. If we turn back, we're as good as dead." Victor, who had taken the lead, paused to study the path ahead. The glowing symbols on the ground had begun to change again, their shapes more erratic and fragmented. "These symbols," he said, gesturing downward, "they're not random. It's like they're trying to communicate, but they're fractured, incomplete." Alex knelt beside one of the glowing patterns, his tablet flickering erratically as he tried to make sense of the readings. "The signal's stronger here," he said, his brow furrowed. "But it's unstable, like it's fighting itself. There's interference, something's disrupting it, or something's trying to stop us," Jake muttered, scanning the trees with his flashlight. The path led them to another clearing, smaller than the last, but no less unsettling. At its center stood a stone archway, weathered and overgrown with vines. The arch was covered in the same alien symbols, but unlike the previous carvings, these glowed with a faint, pulsating light. The air around the arch felt charged, as if the structure itself was alive. "This looks ancient," Anna said, stepping closer to the arch, like it's been here for centuries untouched. "But how is that possible?" "It's not," Victor replied, his tone grim. "This place doesn't follow the rules of time or space. We're in its domain now." As the group approached the arch, the pulsating light intensified, and the air filled with a low, resonant hum. Lila hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But something about the arch called to her, a pull she couldn't explain. "We need to go through," Alex said, his eyes fixed on the archway. "I think it's a portal or a gateway. The signal's strongest here." Before anyone could protest, Alex stepped through the arch. For a moment, he seemed to vanish, his body dissolving into the pulsating light. The group froze, their breath caught in their throats. Then, just as suddenly, Alex reappeared on the other side, unscathed but visibly shaken. "It's safe," he called out, his voice trembling. "But it's different. You have to see it." One by one, the others stepped through the arch, each bracing for the unknown. As they emerged on the other side, they found themselves in a landscape that defied logic. The forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of shimmering mist. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and reflective, like liquid glass, and strange lights danced in the distance. "What is this place?" Elaine whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I think this is where the signal comes from," Lila said, her voice filled with awe. "The source?" But the group's wonder was short-lived. From the mist emerged shadowy figures, their forms shifting and undefined. The same chilling presence they had felt in the forest now surrounded them, stronger and more malevolent than before. "We're not alone," Victor said, his voice low and steady. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, though it felt like a feeble defense against the encroaching darkness. As the figures drew closer, the pulsating symbols on the ground began to glow brighter, casting the group in a circle of light. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as if the symbols themselves were reacting to the presence of the shadows. "They're not attacking," Lila observed, her heart pounding. "They're waiting. Watching. Waiting for what?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. Lila didn't answer. She didn't know. All she knew was that they had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The path had led them here for a reason, and whatever lay ahead, it was far from over. The mist swirled like a living entity, its tendrils curling and unfurling with a sentient grace. The figures that had emerged from its depths remained indistinct, their forms a shifting amalgam of shadows and light. The group stood frozen in the glowing circle, their breaths shallow and eyes darting between the approaching entities. "They're not fully here," Victor said, his voice barely audible. "It's like they exist between dimensions." Lila stepped forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Can we communicate with them?" she asked, half to herself. She couldn't shake the feeling that the shadowy forms weren't entirely hostile, though their presence radiated an oppressive unease. Alex was fixated on his tablet, which now displayed erratic streams of data. "They're emitting a frequency," he said, his voice tight with concentration. "It's almost like speech, but it's layered, too complex to decipher." "They're trying to tell us something," Lila said, taking another cautious step forward. Her instincts were at war with her fear, but the pull of curiosity was irresistible. The ground beneath their feet shimmered, and the glowing symbols pulsed in a rhythmic pattern. A soft, almost imperceptible hum filled the air, growing in intensity until it became a chorus of whispers. The voices were disjointed, overlapping in a language that defied comprehension. "I can't hear them," Elaine said, clutching her head. "It's like they're inside my mind." "You're not the only one," Jake muttered, his jaw clenched. "It's like they're speaking directly to us." Victor's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped the flashlight. "We need to figure out what they want before they decide we're not worth the trouble." The whispers grew louder, forming fragments of words that resonated in the minds of the group. "Seek, answer, release." The meanings were vague, yet carried an undeniable weight, as if the words themselves held the power to shape reality. "What does it mean?" Elaine asked, her voice trembling. "Seek what? Release who?" The figures edged closer, their presence pressing against the boundaries of the circle. The symbols on the ground flared, and a sudden vibration coursed through the air. One of the figures stepped forward, more defined than the others. Its form was humanoid, but ethereal, its features obscured by the ever-shifting mist. "It's pointing," Lila said, her voice shaking as she followed the figure's gesture. Beyond the glowing circle, the mist parted to reveal a structure in the distance, a massive, monolithic spire that seemed to rise endlessly into the void. "That wasn't there before," Jake said, narrowing his eyes. "Or maybe it's always been here, and we couldn't see it," Victor replied. The whispers intensified, and the figure's gesture became more insistent. The message was clear. The spire was their destination. "We have to go," Lila said, her resolve hardening. She turned to the group, her expression a mix of determination and fear. "This is why we're here. We need to find out what's inside." Reluctantly, the others nodded. The glowing symbols on the ground dimmed as they stepped beyond the circle, the figures parting to allow them passage. The path to the spire was lined with faintly glowing markers, their light pulsing in rhythm with the whispers that continued to echo in their minds. As they moved closer to the spire, the oppressive energy grew stronger. The whispers became more coherent, though their meaning remained elusive. Each step felt heavier, as if the air itself was conspiring to hold them back. When they finally reached the base of the spire, the group stopped to take in the sheer scale of the structure. Its surface was smooth and dark, reflecting the faint glow of the mist. A massive door, carved with intricate patterns resembling the glowing symbols, loomed before them. "This is it," Lila said, placing a hand on the door. The surface was cold and unyielding, yet it seemed to hum faintly beneath her touch. As the group stood before the spire, the whispers subsided, replaced by a profound silence that pressed against their ears. Whatever lay beyond the door, it was waiting for them to make the first move. The door before them seemed both inviting and foreboding, an imposing barrier that held the key to whatever lay beyond. It was as if the structure itself was a living, breathing entity, and the group stood on the precipice of something that might alter their very existence. Lila's hand still rested on the cold surface, the hum beneath it growing stronger, vibrating through her fingertips and into her core. "This is it," she whispered again, though this time her voice held no certainty, only a deep, unresolved tension. "This is what we came for." Victor stepped forward, breaking the silence that had enveloped them. His eyes flicked from Lila's hand to the intricate carvings that adorned the door. "Are we sure we want to open this? We've already seen enough to know that whatever's inside isn't going to be anything we can control." Alex was already analyzing his tablet, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The signal's stronger here. It's not just a portal, it's a source. Whatever is happening here, it's the heart of it." Anna, who had remained unusually quiet up until now, spoke up. "What if the answers we're looking for are on the other side? What if it's not just about what we're seeing, but what we don't understand yet? The others turned to her, a brief moment of confusion passing between them before Lila nodded slowly, acknowledging the merit of the idea. "We don't have to understand everything to move forward," she said, her voice firm. "But we do have to open this door to find out." A hesitant silence followed as the group exchanged glances. They all understood that once they opened the door, there was no turning back. They were no longer passive witnesses to strange phenomena. They were active participants in whatever would unfold. Lila took a deep breath and pushed against the door. It didn't budge. It was as if the structure was unwilling to give in so easily, as if it was testing their resolve. Alex, sensing the change in energy, approached the door with his tablet. The readings began to fluctuate wildly, the numbers spiking in ways that defied logic. He scanned the area around them, looking for any sign of how to proceed. "Wait," Alex said suddenly. "There's something hidden. Look at these markings around the edge of the door." The others crowded around him as he pointed to a series of symbols they had missed at first, subtle, almost imperceptible etchings that ran along the outer rim of the doorframe. They were similar to the glowing patterns on the ground, but these had an added complexity, as if they were encoded. "This is it," Victor said, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "We have to match the symbols." "It's like a puzzle." Anna stepped closer, her fingers tracing the markings. "But what do we do if we get it wrong? What if we set something off we can't stop?" Lila gave her a determined look. "We're already past that point. If we don't open this door, we'll be stuck in this place forever. We need to know what's behind it." Taking the lead, Lila carefully adjusted her hand over the markings, pressing on one faint symbol after another. As her fingers moved over them, the glow of the symbols on the door shifted. The humming grew louder, reverberating in the very air around them, and then a sound like ancient stone grinding against stone echoed from within the structure. The door began to move, but not outward. Instead, it slid inward, revealing the darkness beyond. The group stepped back instinctively, hearts racing. The space beyond the threshold was cloaked in shadows, and though the mist continued to swirl around the edges of the opening, there was something profoundly unnatural about what lay inside. "I don't like this," Jake murmured, his eyes scanning the darkness. "It's like everything around us is being swallowed by that thing." The air that escaped from the doorway was thick and oppressive, like breathing underwater. The light from their flashlights seemed to struggle against the darkness, barely penetrating the thick, tangible void inside. It felt as though something was waiting for them, something ancient and full of malice. Yet, there was also a sense of desperate curiosity pulling them forward. "Do you feel that?" Lila asked, her voice soft, almost reverential. "It's like the air is alive." Victor nodded grimly. "I feel it too. It's not just air, it's pressure, like the atmosphere is pressing in from all sides." They stood there for a moment, considering the unknown that awaited them. The whispers from the mist were gone now, replaced by a profound silence that threatened to smother them. In that silence, the only sound was the rhythmic beating of their hearts. "We're going in," Lila declared. "All of us. Together." The group exchanged one last, uncertain look before they crossed the threshold. As they did, the world behind them seemed to vanish, swallowed whole by the darkness of the spire. They were no longer in the same world they had left behind, and nothing would be the same again. The moment the group crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted, and the world outside seemed to evaporate into nothingness. The space they entered was cavernous, stretching beyond what their eyes could immediately comprehend. It was as if they had entered the hollowed core of the earth itself, surrounded by walls that pulsed with an otherworldly energy. The darkness pressed in on them like a living force, but unlike the thick, impenetrable shadows of the outside, this darkness felt fluid, shifting and breathing in unison with their every movement. The air was dense, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rust. Each step they took felt unnaturally slow, as though they were wading through thick liquid, their feet dragging with a strange weight. Lila shivered despite herself, though it wasn't the cold that chilled her. It was a sensation of being surrounded by something much older than human comprehension. "We're not alone," Victor whispered, though no one needed to say it. The feeling of being watched was palpable, creeping beneath the skin like an invisible hand. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, and the oppressive silence felt suffocating, as if they were intruding on a place where they did not belong. Lila's flashlight flickered briefly, casting erratic beams that danced across the cavernous space. The beams revealed faint outlines of what appeared to be inscriptions, strange symbols carved into the walls, their meanings completely indecipherable. The markings were arranged in a pattern that seemed to spiral inward, as if guiding them deeper into the unknown. "Do you think this is some kind of sanctuary?" Anna asked, her voice hushed, as though speaking too loudly might disturb whatever was lurking within the shadows. "I don't know," Lila replied, her eyes scanning the walls. "But these symbols, they don't feel like anything human. This place doesn't feel human." "Then what is it?" Jake said, his voice strained. "What the hell is going on here?" Victor's hand tightened around his flashlight, and his gaze locked onto the distant horizon of the chamber. "Whatever this place is, it's not just abandoned. It's alive somehow. I feel like it's watching us, waiting for us to figure something out." The floor beneath them was uneven, the stone slick with an unidentifiable substance. Every step echoed through the chamber, reverberating against the walls with a strange resonance that seemed to carry on far longer than expected. Lila could feel the vibrations beneath her feet, like a heartbeat that didn't belong to her own body. As they moved deeper into the heart of the space, the darkness seemed to part ahead, revealing a large central area. In the middle of the chamber stood a massive, ancient structure, unlike anything the group had seen before. It was a twisted, asymmetrical sculpture, its form a chaotic blend of organic and mechanical elements. It looked as though it had been crafted by something not entirely of this world, a convergence of biological growth and artificial construct. The surface of the structure was alive with motion, a web of lines and patterns shifting across its surface like veins pulsating beneath the skin. This is where we need to be," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the fragile balance of the moment. Victor stepped closer to the structure, his eyes narrowing as he took in every detail. "What do you think it is? Some kind of machine? A vessel?" "I don't think it's either," Anna replied, her voice filled with uncertainty. "It doesn't feel like technology. It feels like it's been here longer than we can understand, like it's been waiting for us." As they circled the structure, Lila's flashlight caught a small opening near the base. The edges of the opening were covered in more of the strange symbols they had seen on the walls. The area around it seemed to pulse faintly, responding to the light in a way that felt deliberate. It was almost as if the structure was beckoning them, inviting them to discover whatever lay hidden inside. "We have to go inside," Lila said, her tone resolute. "This is why we're here. This is the answer." With a shared sense of determination, the group moved toward the opening. The closer they got, the stronger the sensation of being drawn and became, as though the structure itself was pulling them closer. Every instinct told them to turn back, to leave this place, and never look back, but the pull was undeniable. They were no longer just researchers. They were participants in something much larger, something beyond their understanding. As they entered the opening, the air grew heavier, the darkness more tangible. Their flashlights illuminated the interior, revealing a vast chamber within the structure. At the center of the space was a pedestal, atop which lay a single, pulsating orb. The orb's light was a deep, unnatural green, flickering as if it were alive. And from it, a low hum emanated, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within their bones. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, in the distance, a voice, soft, yet unmistakably clear, whispered in the air around them. "You shouldn't have come." The whisper echoed through the chamber, reverberating off the walls with a chilling clarity that made their skin crawl. It was a voice unlike any they had ever heard before, inhuman, yet filled with a strange familiarity. As it reached them, it seemed to dissolve into the very fabric of the air, leaving behind a suffocating silence that hung heavily in the space. The orb in the center of the pedestal continued to pulse with its eerie green glow, its hum growing louder, almost insistent. For a moment, the group stood frozen, caught between fear and curiosity. They had come all this way, passed through trials that tested their sanity, only to be confronted with an unknown voice that seemed to carry an unspoken warning. The words, "You shouldn't have come," weighed heavily in the air, and yet they were more than just a warning. They were a statement, as if the voice knew something they didn't. Victor was the first to break the silence, his voice trembling but firm. "Who's there? What is this place?" His words felt small against the oppressive weight of the chamber, swallowed almost immediately by the pulsating hum of the orb. The voice did not respond directly, but instead seemed to shift in tone, as though the entity was considering the group's presence, weighing its options. And then, as if deciding they had earned an answer, the voice spoke again, this time slower, deeper, and filled with a strange reverberation that rattled their bones. "You are not meant to understand. You are not ready to see the truth." Lila felt a cold shiver run down her spine. There was something terrifyingly certain about the way the voice spoke, as though it had been waiting for them to arrive. But more unsettling than that was the realization that it knew them, knew exactly who they were and why they were here. "Truth," Anna echoed softly, as if the word itself held some terrible weight. "What truth?" The voice paused, as if in contemplation, before responding. "The truth of your existence, of the universe, of the force that has always been and the one that seeks to change it all." Alex, who had been quiet up until this point, moved forward, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "This isn't just about UFOs or alien contact, is it? This is something bigger. This place, this structure, it's not just a beacon. It's a nexus." The voice seemed to acknowledge his words with a faint vibration in the air. "You are close, but you cannot yet see the full picture. There are those who have come before you, and those who will come after. The cycle is endless, and you are merely players in a game you do not yet understand." The hum of the orb intensified, and the walls around them seemed to shift, warping as if the very nature of the space was bending to some unseen will. For a brief moment, the room became something else, something foreign and ancient, like a memory long forgotten, resurfacing with a force that threatened to overwhelm them. Are we supposed to stop?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper, as though he feared even the smallest disturbance would trigger something catastrophic. "Is that why we've been warned?" "You will stop when you understand," the voice responded, its tone oddly serene, as if it had already foreseen their every hesitation. "But not until you are ready, until you see the web that binds you to this place, to this fate." The group exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that whatever force was speaking to them was not bound by the same rules of time and space they were. It was ancient, and it was aware of every move they made. They had stumbled into something far greater than they could have anticipated. "Maybe we're not meant to understand right now," Lila murmured, her gaze fixed on the orb, her mind racing with the implications of what they were being told. "But we have to try. We can't leave without answers." Victor took a step forward, his voice low but resolute. "We didn't come this far to turn back now. We have to face this, whatever it is." The voice seemed to respond to their resolve with a low, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh, as if it were both amused and resigned to the course of events. "Very well," it said, its tone heavy with finality. "But be warned, the answers you seek will change you. The truth is not something you can walk away from once you have seen it." The orb's glow intensified in response, the pulsations quickening, and for a moment, the group was enveloped in a bright, green light. The air hummed louder, vibrating with an energy that seemed to penetrate their very beings. The chamber around them blurred, fading into something indistinct, as if the fabric of reality itself was unraveling before their eyes. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and they could feel the pulse of the orb syncing with their heartbeats. As the light reached its zenith, Lila's vision blurred, and for the first time, she could hear the voice clearly within her mind, not spoken aloud but felt deep within her consciousness. "Are you ready to see?" The question hung in the air like a dare, and Lila's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had no choice but to face whatever came next. The voice wasn't asking for permission. It was simply stating what was inevitable. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice above the rising hum. "We're ready." The moment Lila spoke those words, something within the chamber shifted. The air seemed to vibrate with an invisible force, pulling at the very threads of reality that held everything together. It was as if the space around them was no longer confined to the limits of their understanding. Time itself felt elastic, stretching and contracting in ways that defied all logic. The orb at the center of the room pulsed with an intensity that sent waves of disorientation through them. Their surroundings seemed to blur and distort, and in that fleeting moment, it felt as though the laws of nature no longer applied. For a brief second, Lila thought she could see flashes, fragments of memories, or perhaps they were visions, unfolding before her eyes. The past, the present, and the future collided in a dizzying, kaleidoscopic swirl. Faces she didn't recognize flashed by, interspersed with images of the UFO phenomena they had been investigating. The symbols, the strange lights in the sky, and the mysterious reports they had read all seemed to converge in a single, overwhelming wave. Each flash was more vivid than the last, and yet she couldn't hold on to them long enough to make sense of it. Victor, too, seemed to be struggling with the same sensation. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the pedestal for support. "What is happening?" he gasped, his voice cracking as if the very fabric of his being was being torn apart. This isn't just a place, it's a rift. It's pulling us in." His words were strained, as though he were fighting against the weight of something beyond their comprehension. Alex, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly spoke, his voice steady but filled with a sense of urgency. "The orb, it's not just a beacon or a tool. It's a conduit, a link to something far greater, something outside of our reality. This place is a nexus of sorts, a bridge between dimensions, and it's trying to pull us through." Lila turned toward him, her heart racing. "You're saying we've crossed into something else? A different reality?" She could barely process his words, but they made sense in a way that terrified her. The room seemed to stretch in unnatural ways, and for a split second, she thought she saw shadows move just beyond the edges of her vision. It was as though they were being watched, monitored by forces they couldn't see, but could feel. "Not just any reality," Alex continued, his gaze distant as if he were speaking to himself. "Something older, something that has always been. This orb, this chamber, it's not merely a physical structure. It's a living entity. It's been here for eons, waiting for someone to unlock its secrets." The group fell into an uneasy silence as they absorbed his words. The air in the room grew thick with tension, each of them aware that they were standing on the precipice of an unimaginable truth. The more they delved into the mystery of the orb, the more they realized that they were not just investigating an extraterrestrial phenomenon. They were stepping into something much larger, something that had been watching them long before they even knew of its existence. As the minutes passed, the hum of the orb began to change. The frequency altered, becoming lower and more resonant, vibrating through their bodies like a bass note reverberating in their bones. It was as though the orb was calling to them, trying to communicate. But with each passing second, the sound grew more insistent, more demanding. Lila could feel it pressing against her chest, a weight that seemed to bear down on her soul. It was impossible to ignore. "We need to leave," Jake said suddenly, his voice urgent. He had backed away from the pedestal, his eyes wide with panic. "This is wrong. This place is not meant for us. We're disturbing something ancient, something that doesn't want us here." Lila hesitated, torn between her instinct to run and the need to uncover the truth. The allure of the orb, the pull of the unknown, was strong. It beckoned to her, urging her to stay just a little longer. She could feel the weight of the voice inside her mind, that presence that had spoken to them earlier, now louder, as though it were brushing against the edges of her thoughts. "You are here for a reason. You have always been here." The words sent a jolt of realization through her. It was like a key had turned in her mind. The voice, the orb, it wasn't just speaking to them in the present. It had been speaking to them all along from the very beginning. Their investigation, their search for answers, it had all been leading them here. They hadn't stumbled upon this place by chance. This was the culmination of everything that had come before. "We can't leave," Lila said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not now. We're part of this. Whatever it is." The others looked at her, confusion and fear written on their faces, but there was no turning back. The room seemed to pulse with an energy that now felt all-encompassing, wrapping around them, pulling them into the heart of whatever truth lay beneath. It was as if the orb had awakened something within them, something buried deep in their minds, and now it was all coming to the surface. Suddenly, the floor beneath them trembled once more, and the lights in the chamber flickered. The orb flared brightly, casting long, twisting shadows on the walls. The voices in their heads grew louder, each one of them hearing different words, different fragments of a message that they couldn't fully comprehend. Yet in the chaos, they all shared one feeling. This was just the beginning. The unraveling had started, and there was no stopping it now. Lila's pulse quickened as the walls of the chamber seemed to bend and twist, warping in ways that defied any logical explanation. The boundaries of time, space, and reality were no longer clear. The orb was no longer a mere object. It was alive, and it was pulling them into its core, into a place where the rules of existence didn't apply. The truth was near, and whether they were ready or not, they were about to face it. Time was no longer on their side. The days following their descent into the orb's influence were a blur. No one could quite remember the exact moment they left the chamber. Their recollections were fragmented, like shattered pieces of a mirror, each reflecting a version of the truth that was both familiar and completely alien. They had emerged from the room, but it felt as though they had crossed a threshold into something deeper, a place where the fabric of reality itself had been distorted beyond recognition. The world outside had changed in subtle ways. Shadows lingered longer, the air felt heavier, and the sky above seemed to flicker with an unnatural light. Lila, still haunted by the images that had flooded her mind, found herself questioning everything she thought she knew. The orb had awakened something in them, something they could not fully explain. It was as if their minds were now attuned to a frequency beyond their comprehension, a signal from a distant, unknowable source. What had been a group of researchers investigating UFOs had now become something more, something tied to an ancient intelligence that had always watched over them. "We're not just dealing with extraterrestrials," Alex had said when they reconvened in the small, dimly lit motel room that had become their temporary base. His voice was tense, as though the weight of his own realization was too much to bear. "We're dealing with something older, something that predates humanity itself." The idea lingered in the air like an electric charge, crackling with a sense of inevitability. Lila couldn't shake the image of the orb's pulsing light, the way it seemed to reach into her very soul. It was as if the object knew them, knew everything about them, and yet it offered nothing in return. No answers, no comforting explanations, just silence. Silence that echoed with the weight of infinite knowledge. Despite their collective unease, the group had agreed to continue their investigation. They had come too far to turn back now. But as they dug deeper into their research, the lines between their work and the supernatural began to blur. Every document they uncovered, every recording they listened to, seemed to suggest that the orb was not an isolated phenomenon. There were other incidents, scattered reports of strange lights, inexplicable disappearances, and mysterious symbols, each one pointing to a pattern that was impossible to ignore. It became clear that the orb was part of something much larger, something that transcended their understanding of time and space. The records they found spoke of ancient civilizations, ones long forgotten by history, that had come into contact with beings or forces that were beyond their comprehension. These civilizations had tried to understand the orb, to communicate with the intelligence it represented, but each attempt had ended in disaster. The further they pushed, the more the orb fought back, its influence growing stronger with each passing day. The deeper they dug, the more disoriented they became. Every revelation seemed to spawn more questions, more doubts. Who were these ancient beings that had left such cryptic messages behind? Why had they chosen to contact humanity now? And perhaps most chilling of all, what was the orb's true purpose? Was it a tool of enlightenment or a weapon designed to reshape the world? One night, as Lila lay awake in her bed, the faint hum of the orb still reverberating in her mind, she heard a sound, an almost imperceptible whisper. It was distant, like a faint wind rustling through the trees, but it was there, calling to her. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized it was the same voice that had spoken to her in the chamber, the voice that had seemed to know everything about her. "You are the key." The words echoed in her mind, repeating like a mantra. "You are the chosen one." She sat up quickly, her mind racing. She wasn't sure if the voice was a product of her exhaustion or if it was something far more sinister. But one thing was certain, whatever they had unleashed, it wasn't something they could control. It was a force that had been waiting, patiently biding its time, and now that it had made contact, there was no going back. The next day, the group met to discuss their findings, but there was an unease in the air that none of them could ignore. It was clear that they were no longer the same people who had arrived in this small town weeks earlier. They had become something else, a part of something larger, something that had been set in motion long before they ever crossed the threshold of the chamber. "What are we doing?" Jake asked, his voice hollow. "What if this thing isn't meant for us? What if we're just pawns in a much bigger game?" His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. Lila had asked herself the same question many times, but there was no clear answer. The orb had chosen them, or perhaps they had chosen it. Either way, they were inextricably linked to whatever force lay behind it. And the deeper they delved into its secrets, the more they realized that the true nature of the orb and its purpose was something they were not prepared to understand. Lila had always believed that the search for the truth was a noble pursuit, but now, in the face of the orb's overwhelming presence, she wasn't so sure. The knowledge it offered was both a gift and a curse, and it was clear that the cost of uncovering it would be far higher than any of them could have anticipated. As she looked around at her companions, she saw the same realization reflected in their eyes. They were no longer just researchers. They were participants in a much larger and far more dangerous experiment. And yet, despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, they couldn't stop. The pull of the orb, the drive to uncover its secrets, was too strong. It was as if they had been marked, chosen for a purpose they couldn't escape. They had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The truth was out there, somewhere, and they were determined to find it, no matter what the cost. As the days wore on, the group's sense of reality began to warp. What had initially felt like an ordinary investigation into UFO phenomena had escalated into something far more dangerous and incomprehensible. It was as though they had been dragged into a deep, cosmic rift where the laws of physics and logic no longer applied. They had all changed, though in subtle ways. The orb, which had once seemed like an isolated anomaly, had now become a central figure in their lives, its influence growing steadily stronger. It pulsed in their minds, beckoning them to uncover more, urging them to peel back the layers of reality and expose the dark truth that lay beneath. Lila felt its pull most acutely. She couldn't escape the nagging sensation that the orb was watching her, guiding her thoughts like a puppet master pulling invisible strings. The dream she had once dismissed as mere exhaustion had grown more vivid with every passing night. In them, she was no longer a mere observer. She was an active participant in a narrative that transcended time itself, a narrative that defied all human understanding. At times, Lila could swear she was hearing the voices of the ancient beings that had left their mark on humanity millennia ago. Their words were indistinct, but their intent was clear. They were calling her to join them, to become a part of their infinite existence. She could sense their thoughts swirling around her mind, their presence pushing her closer to the edge of madness. She fought to stay grounded, but every time she tried to escape, to disconnect from the orb, its influence only grew stronger. It was as if the orb had woven itself into her very essence. Jake was not immune to this strange transformation. He had always been the skeptic, the one who dismissed the idea of extraterrestrial contact as nothing more than a delusion. But as the group ventured deeper into their investigation, Jake's confidence in his rationality began to erode. The more they learned, the more the lines between fiction and reality blurred. It wasn't just the orb itself that unsettled him, but the idea that they were being manipulated, pulled towards something larger, something incomprehensible. The group had been working tirelessly to decode the messages they had discovered within the ancient texts and symbols. Yet the deeper they delved, the more disconnected they became from the world around them. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Days and nights blended together, and the boundaries between the past, present, and future began to dissolve. It was as if they were on the cusp of a revelation too vast for the human mind to comprehend. Each breakthrough brought them closer to understanding, but also closer to losing themselves entirely. One evening, after hours of exhausting work, Lila stumbled upon a passage that seemed to speak directly to her. The words were cryptic, but the meaning was unmistakable. The chosen will not walk alone. The truth lies beyond the veil, in the place where all things converge. As she read it aloud, the air in the room seemed to shift. A sudden chill filled the space, and the orb, which had remained dormant on the table, emitted a faint glow. Lila's heart raced, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew that she had crossed a line. The orb had acknowledged her, had called her by name. Alex, ever the practical one, noticed the change in the atmosphere and quickly grabbed his notes. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice tight with apprehension. The others gathered around, their eyes wide with curiosity and fear. Lila could hardly respond. Her hands trembled as she closed the ancient book, her mind racing to make sense of the passage she had just read. The air felt thick with anticipation, as though something momentous was about to unfold. "We need to be careful," Lila finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just a phenomenon we can study. It's affecting us, changing us in ways we can't control. I don't know how much longer we can keep going before it consumes us entirely." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The group had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. The more they uncovered, the more the orb seemed to shape their reality, bending it to its will. It was as though the orb was not merely an object to be studied. It was a living, breathing entity, one that fed on their fear, their curiosity, and their desperation. Alex, who had been the most cautious of the group, now looked pale. "We've seen too much," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't know if we're ready for what comes next." But Lila knew. The orb had shown them glimpses of something greater, something beyond their understanding. But that knowledge came at a price. The closer they got to the truth, the more they felt themselves slipping into a dark abyss. And yet, despite the fear that gripped them all, there was a part of Lila that couldn't stop. The orb had chosen her, and she could feel it pulling her forward, dragging her toward an unknown fate. In the midst of their collective unease, Jake made a decision. He picked up the orb, holding it in his hands as though it were the key to unlocking everything they had been searching for. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice low but resolute. "No matter what it takes." The group exchanged nervous glances, but no one spoke. The orb seemed to pulse in Jake's hands, as though it had heard him. It was a moment that felt both terrifying and inevitable, as though the orb had been waiting for this exact moment to act. As Jake held it, the room grew colder. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, as if in answer to his unspoken command, the orb began to glow brighter, its light filling the room, blinding them all. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she realized that they were no longer merely researchers in a bizarre and terrifying investigation. They had become something else, participants in a cosmic game they were not equipped to understand. And with that, the descent into madness had begun. The orb had become something far beyond their expectations. What was once an enigma, a mere object of their curiosity, had now turned into an agent of transformation. The group, who had come together to study UFO phenomena, was slowly coming to the unsettling realization that they were no longer just researchers. They were players in a much larger, far more dangerous game. The orb had invited them into its realm, and with every passing moment, they felt the pull of its influence. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been unraveled, piece by piece, leaving them standing at the threshold of something incomprehensible. The room, once filled with the sound of scribbling notes and quiet conversation, had become eerily silent. Each person sat in a trance-like state, their eyes fixed on the orb, which now lay in the center of their table, glowing faintly. The light it emitted was not harsh, but soft, almost hypnotic, and it seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats. As the hours passed, they all felt a growing sense of unease, but it was mixed with an undeniable attraction, a desire to understand, to uncover the secrets the orb promised. It was as if the orb had reached into their souls, tapping into the deepest recesses of their fears and desires. Lila, who had been the most affected by the orb's influence, was now the most distant. Her eyes were glassy, as though she had been pulled into another dimension. Her thoughts, once sharp and focused, were now fragmented, swirling in patterns that made no sense. She couldn't tell where her mind ended and where the orb's presence began. The more she tried to pull away from it, the stronger its grip seemed to become. It was not just the orb itself. It was the awareness that something far larger than themselves was at work, something that transcended human understanding. Jake, too, was changing. Though he had once been the skeptic, the voice of reason in the group, his rationality was beginning to slip. The orb had brought him closer to an understanding of the universe. But that understanding was more terrifying than he had ever anticipated. It was as if he was standing at the edge of a great abyss, and the orb was pulling him into it. His skepticism was fading, replaced by a strange longing to know the truth, no matter the cost. He could feel the orb's call, like an unspoken invitation to cross over into a realm beyond the physical. The others were not immune to the orb's influence either. Alex, once a pragmatist, was now driven by an obsessive curiosity. He pored over the symbols they had deciphered, believing that the answers they sought were hidden within them. Each revelation only seemed to deepen his obsession. He would stay up for hours, staring at the strange patterns, as though waiting for them to reveal their true meaning. He would mutter to himself, his voice growing more frantic with each passing hour. It was clear to the others that Alex was losing his grip on reality, and yet, none of them could bring themselves to stop. The orb had drawn them all into its web. But it was Lila who felt the invitation most clearly. In the quiet of the night, when the others were asleep, she would sit alone in front of the orb. It was during these solitary moments that she felt the true power of its presence. The messages it sent were not clear words, but a feeling, a knowledge, deep and primal, that flowed through her like electricity. The orb was calling her to something. She was certain of it now, but the more she understood, the less she felt like herself. She no longer knew where her identity ended and the orb's will began. It had consumed her in ways she couldn't describe. The invitation was not spoken, yet it was felt by all of them. It wasn't just an invitation to continue their research. It was an invitation to cross a line, to leave behind their humanity and step into a world where the rules of existence no longer applied. Lila had become convinced that they were being called to become part of something greater, something that existed outside of time and space. She saw glimpses of other realms, other dimensions where the laws of physics didn't hold sway. But those glimpses were brief, fleeting, and always left her with a deep sense of dread. In their moments of lucidity, the group tried to make sense of their experience. They would gather together, attempting to piece together their thoughts, to re-establish their sense of normalcy. But no matter how hard they tried, the orb's influence was undeniable. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no going back. The more they resisted, the stronger the pull became. It was as if the orb had infected their minds, luring them deeper into its grip. "I can't stop thinking about it," Alex confessed one night, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fascination. "I know it's changing us, but I can't stop myself. I don't want to stop." His words hung in the air like a confession, but they were also an admission of surrender. Jake, who had been silent for some time, finally spoke up. "We have to understand it," he said, his voice low and measured. "We're so close. Whatever it is, whatever it wants from us, we need to see it through. Lila, her face pale and drawn, looked at the orb with a mixture of awe and fear. She could feel its pull more strongly now, as though it was calling her name, asking her to step into the unknown. And though part of her resisted, part of her, perhaps the deepest part of her, wanted to accept the invitation. She wanted to know what lay beyond the veil. She wanted to understand the true nature of the universe, no matter what the cost. The orb pulsed once more, its glow intensifying. For a moment, the world around them seemed to freeze. The air was thick with anticipation, as though the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. And then, without warning, everything changed. The orb's light flickered, and for a brief moment, it seemed to be a doorway, one that would take them into a world they could never have imagined. The invitation had been extended. The question was no longer whether they would accept, it was whether they were strong enough to resist. The moment the orb's light flickered and transformed into a doorway, the atmosphere in the room changed. It was as if the very air itself had thickened, becoming dense with anticipation. The invitation had been extended, and the group stood on the precipice of something monumental. Lila, still staring at the orb, felt a surge of energy pulsing through her body. It was as though the universe itself had aligned for this very moment. There was no turning back now. For a long while, no one spoke. Each member of the group stood frozen, as if caught between the familiar world they had known and the unknown that beckoned beyond. They had come to study UFO phenomena, to explore the edges of human understanding, but they had never imagined being offered a glimpse beyond the boundaries of reality. The orb had shifted from being an object of mystery to something much more, a portal, an invitation, and perhaps a test. Lila's eyes were fixed on the orb's fluctuating light. It was mesmerizing, a hypnotic pulse that seemed to echo in her chest. She could feel the weight of the group's collective gaze upon her. The others were waiting for her to make a decision, to take the first step, but deep down, she knew that they were all equally bound by the orb's pull. The orb had called them all, each of them drawn in for reasons they could not fully explain. The invitation was personal, but it had become something much larger than any individual. Jake was the first to break the silence. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it reverberated with the gravity of the moment. "We came here to understand," he said, his eyes not leaving the orb. "We came here to find answers. But this is beyond understanding." His words hung in the air, a stark reminder of how far they had come from their original intentions. What they had thought would be a simple investigation into UFO events had transformed into something far more inexplicable. Alex, ever the pragmatist, was struggling. His mind raced, torn between the scientific curiosity that had brought him to this point and the growing dread that now filled his thoughts. What would happen if they stepped through? What if the orb wasn't just a portal to another world, but a doorway to their own destruction? He could feel the cold sweat collecting on the back of his neck, his heart pounding. But even as fear gripped him, there was something else, a part of him that yearned to know, to step through and discover what lay on the other side. "Do we have a choice?" Lila asked, her voice soft but filled with an undeniable certainty. She turned away from the orb to face the others. Her eyes, once sharp and decisive, now seemed clouded, as if the orb had rewritten her very essence. "The orb has already chosen us. We are here because it wants us to be. We are part of something greater than ourselves now." Her words hit each of them like a cold wave. They had all felt it, the growing pull of the orb, the feeling of being chosen. But what did it mean? What had they signed up for? And why did it feel so impossible to walk away? Lila's statement, though unsettling, felt true. They were no longer in control of their own fates. They had crossed a threshold, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the light from the orb flared brightly, nearly blinding them. The room seemed to distort, the walls bending and warping as though the very fabric of reality was coming apart. Time itself seemed to stretch and bend, its rules no longer holding true. The air was thick with an electric charge, as though the space between dimensions was thinning. Lila, without thinking, took a step toward the orb. It was a natural impulse, one that had been building in her for hours. The others followed her instinctively, unable to resist. Alex, his skepticism and fear momentarily forgotten, moved closer, his eyes wide with both dread and awe. Jake, his face pale, clenched his fists as though trying to hold on to something, anything, that might keep him grounded. But there was nothing to hold on to. The orb had consumed them all, and now it was pulling them forward. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything changed. The room they had once occupied vanished, replaced by a vast expanse of swirling darkness and light. There was no sense of up or down, no sense of direction. It was as if they were suspended in an endless void, surrounded by a landscape that defied logic. The air was heavy with a presence they could not explain, and the silence was deafening. The only sound was the soft hum of the orb's energy, which now seemed to surround them completely. Lila's heart raced, her breath shallow as she looked around at the others. But they were no longer the people she had known. The orb had transformed them in subtle ways, altering their perceptions and their very beings. They had crossed into a new world, but it was not just a physical place, it was a mental and spiritual realm as well. They were no longer the same people who had entered the room hours ago. "Is this real?" Jake whispered, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. He reached out, his hand trembling, but the darkness around them absorbed his movement, as though it were swallowing him whole. "Is any of this real?" But Lila knew. The truth was no longer something they could define. They had entered a space beyond human comprehension, and in doing so, they had lost the ability to distinguish between reality and illusion. The orb had opened a gateway, not just to another place, but to another understanding, one that defied everything they had ever known. As the group stood there, suspended in the infinite void, they realized that they were not alone. Far in the distance, at the edge of the swirling light, figures appeared, shadowy, indistinct forms that seemed to watch them. Were they beings from another world? Or were they something else, something more sinister, that had been waiting for them all along? The orb had promised answers, but the cost of those answers had yet to reveal itself. And as the group stood there, they couldn't help but wonder if they had made a terrible mistake, if the invitation they had so eagerly accepted would ultimately be their undoing. As the strange void enveloped them, the group struggled to make sense of the disorienting space around them. The shifting lights and impenetrable darkness had swallowed the room they had once known. But it wasn't just the environment that felt alien. Something deeper, something within them, had shifted as well. The orb had opened a doorway to a realm far beyond the physical, where time, space, and reality were all mutable, and the rules of human existence no longer applied. Lila could feel it in her chest, the overwhelming presence of something intangible, yet immensely powerful. The air was thick with energy, and every breath she took seemed to echo inside her, reverberating in the emptiness. The silence was oppressive, as if the universe itself had paused in anticipation. There were no sounds, no clues to their location, only the soft hum of the orb, now dimming into a faint pulse as if it were fading out of existence. "What are we supposed to do now?" Alex's voice cracked in the stillness. He was still standing, rooted in place, unable to process the enormity of what had just happened. They had crossed into something impossible, into an unknown space where human comprehension had no footing. The feeling of weightlessness pressed against him, both mentally and physically, and the uncertainty of their situation was unbearable. Were they even in the same universe anymore? The others looked to Lila. She had always been the one to make decisions, the one who kept them grounded through the strange events they had encountered. But now, even she seemed uncertain. Her eyes darted around, scanning the void, searching for something familiar, something that might offer an explanation. But there was nothing, only darkness and faint, shimmering lights that flickered like distant stars. "I don't know," Lila admitted, her voice low and filled with a strange, uneasy calm. "But we're here now, and I think we need to understand why." They stood together, the tension between them palpable, each person wrapped in their own confusion and fear. Yet despite this, there was an undeniable pull, a collective sense that the answers they sought lay ahead, somewhere in the vastness around them. The orb had led them here for a reason, and it wasn't just to show them the unknown. No, the orb had brought them to witness something. The question now was, what were they meant to witness? Suddenly, from the farthest edge of their vision, figures began to emerge. At first, they were barely distinguishable from the swirling darkness. Shadowy forms, shifting like smoke, appeared and disappeared, their outlines blurred and fleeting. But as they drew closer, their presence became more distinct. They were humanoid in shape, though there was an uncanny quality to their appearance. Their bodies shimmered with an ethereal glow, the edges of their forms flickering like flames. Yet their faces were obscured by a strange mist. Are those? Jake started, but the words faltered in his throat. His eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of awe and dread. He couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. They were the figures, the witnesses, the entities that the orb had promised. But who or what were they? Lila stepped forward, drawn to the figures by a force she couldn't explain. It was as if their presence called to something deep within her, something that had been awakened by the orb's power. The figures moved closer, their movements fluid and unnatural, as if they were both part of the space and beyond it at the same time. As they approached, the air grew colder, the stillness pressing in on them even more. The closer they came, the more Lila felt the weight of their gaze. Though their faces were hidden, there was an undeniable sense of being observed, of being understood on a level that transcended human consciousness. It was as if the figures could see beyond the surface, could see into their very souls. Do they want something from us? Alex asked, his voice trembling. Are they going to hurt us? Lila couldn't answer. She didn't know. The figures didn't seem hostile, but neither did they appear benevolent. Their presence was too otherworldly, too unsettling. They were like visitors from a different plane, and the group was no more than an audience to their existence. As the figures drew closer, one of them stepped forward. It was taller than the rest, its form shimmering with a silver-blue light that contrasted with the darker, more muted hues of the others. It raised its hand slowly, an open gesture that seemed almost welcoming, yet there was an undeniable sense of finality in the movement. Lila felt a sharp pull in her chest, a force that urged her forward, as if the figure's gesture was an invitation, a call that she couldn't resist. Lila, wait! Jake called out, but she didn't hear him. It was as if her body moved of its own accord, propelled by the unseen force that had taken hold of her. She stepped closer to the figure, the distance between them shrinking with each passing second. The others stood frozen, unable to move, their eyes wide with a mix of fear and confusion. The figure's hand stopped just in front of Lila, the space between them humming with an energy that Lila could feel vibrating through her body. For a moment, everything was still. The figure's form flickered, and then, as if sensing Lila's thoughts, it spoke, though its voice was not heard in the conventional sense. It was more of a feeling, an impression that filled her mind. We have been waiting, the voice whispered in her mind, the words slow and deliberate, like an echo from a distant past. You are the witnesses. You are the ones chosen to see beyond, to understand what has been hidden, but you must decide. Will you continue to witness, or will you return to the darkness? The figure's words sent a chill down Lila's spine. The invitation was clear, but the consequences were far from. They had crossed a threshold, but now, they were faced with a decision that carried unimaginable weight. Would they press forward into whatever lay beyond, or would they turn back, forever altered by what they had witnessed? Lila didn't know the answer, but as she looked into the shimmering eyes of the figure, she knew that the choice would not be easy. In whatever path they chose, there would be no going back to the lives they once knew. The moment hung in the air like the fragile balance between night and day, teetering on the precipice of something far beyond the comprehension of the group. Lila stood there, her body frozen, her mind a whirlpool of questions and doubt. The figure before her, taller than the others and radiating an otherworldly light, had just spoken words that pierced the veil of reality itself. She felt as though the very fabric of her existence had been ripped open, exposing a truth she was not sure she was ready to face. We have been waiting, the voice had whispered, But those words had not offered comfort. They had only served to deepen the confusion that already swirled around her. You are the witnesses. You are the ones chosen to see beyond. The phrase, "see beyond," echoed in her mind, like a riddle that demanded an answer, yet provided no clue. She glanced at the others, Alex, Jake, and the others, all of them standing on the edge, caught in the same state of paralysis, unable to move or speak. The orb, now dimmed and almost invisible in the expanse of the void, had led them here, but it was the figure's presence that carried the weight of the decision they had to make. The question hung between them like a sword on a thread. Will you continue to witness, or will you return to the darkness? The tension in the air was palpable. The others were waiting for Lila to decide, but how could she? How could anyone? What did it mean to witness something that transcended human experience? What would they be asked to witness next, and what would they lose in the process? We need to understand what they want, Jake finally whispered, his voice barely audible. Lila turned to face him, her expression clouded with the same uncertainty that clung to her. He was right. They had no answers, only an increasing number of questions, none of which seemed to be answered by the figures standing before them. And yet, despite the overwhelming unknown, there was something compelling, something alluring about what was being offered. They had come seeking answers about UFOs, but the experience had spiraled into something far more sinister, something that reached into the very heart of existence. Do you think we're meant to understand? Lila asked, her voice trembling. Maybe there's no understanding this. Maybe it's beyond us. Jake shook his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. But we have to understand. If we don't, what was the point of all this? What was the point of the orb? Of everything that's happened? Lila knew that Jake was right. They had been drawn into something inexplicable, something much larger than their initial pursuit of understanding UFO phenomena. What had started as an intellectual curiosity had become a journey that blurred the line between human consciousness and the unknown. They were no longer just researchers. They had become witnesses to something that existed beyond their world, a cosmic revelation that defied the very rules of reality. And yet, the question still hung before them. Would they step further into the unknown? The figure seemed to sense Lila's internal conflict. Its shimmering form flickered again, and the voice filled her mind once more, its tone insistent yet calm. You have seen the truth. You have felt the pull of something greater than yourselves. The darkness will not let you return without its mark. But if you choose to witness, you will be forever altered. The path is not without consequence. The figure's words left a bitter taste in Lila's mouth. Forever altered. Those words resonated deep within her, deep within all of them. They weren't just being asked to witness something. They were being asked to accept a new reality, to leave behind everything they had once known, in exchange for an understanding of the universe that defied logic, that rejected human limitations. And still, the group remained silent. Their fear was palpable, but so was their curiosity. Could they truly turn back? Was it possible to walk away from what they had seen, from the knowledge that now lived in their minds, a gnawing hunger for answers that nothing else could satisfy? Lila could feel her heart racing. She had come this far, and yet now, standing on the precipice, the weight of the decision pressed down on her like 1,000 tons. The consequences were too immense to ignore. They had already crossed a line, had already seen glimpses of something that stretched the boundaries of time and space, and there was no turning back from that. But would it be worth it? To risk everything? To leave behind the world they knew for a promise of something greater, something that may well destroy them? Lila, whatever we choose, we need to stick together, Alex said, his voice surprisingly firm despite the fear that flickered in his eyes. The others murmured in agreement, their voices a chorus of uncertainty, but one that spoke to the shared bond between them. They had come together as strangers, drawn into this bizarre journey by their shared fascination with the unknown. Now, they faced a decision that would either cement their unity or tear them apart forever. Lila turned to face the figure again, the decision looming in front of her. The path forward felt like a chasm, dark and uninviting, yet somehow necessary. The orb had brought them here for a reason, and perhaps that reason was not for them to fully comprehend. Perhaps it was a test, one of humanity's deepest, most profound struggles, to look into the abyss and decide whether to continue forward or retreat into the comfort of the familiar. "I don't know what we're supposed to do," Lila whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I know we have no choice but to keep going." The figure before her seemed to nod, its form flickering more brightly now, as if it recognized the weight of her words. And with that simple, unspoken gesture, the group found their resolve. They had made their choice, not because they understood, but because they had no other option. The orb began to pulse with a new intensity, its glow more brilliant than before, as though it were waiting for the decision to be made. Lila closed her eyes, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back. They were not just witnesses, they were part of something larger than they could ever have imagined. The universe had changed them, and now they had to find out how. The air was thick with tension as the group moved forward, unsure of what lay ahead, but knowing they had crossed a threshold that could never be undone. The orb, now a pulsating beacon in the distance, guided them forward with a force that seemed both magnetic and oppressive. As they walked, the landscape around them shifted subtly, its edges blurring and melting in ways that defied logic. The sky was no longer simply black. It was a swirling expanse of infinite hues, colors they had no names for. Time seemed to stretch and contract in a dance that could not be understood, yet every step they took felt as though it were both the first and the last. It was impossible to tell how much time had passed. Hours? Days? Or perhaps mere moments had been stretched into eternity. The group had long stopped trying to measure the passage of time. It had become irrelevant. All that mattered now was the ever-growing pull of the orb ahead, the sense that something monumental was waiting for them at the end of this journey. Lila could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last, echoing in her ears. She could feel the fear, the anticipation, the crushing weight of all that had been revealed to them. The truth of the universe, the truth of their own existence, had been laid bare before them, yet no answers had been given. The knowledge they had gained was not comforting. It was unsettling, disorienting. They had come to understand that the universe was far older, far more complex, and far more indifferent than they could have ever imagined. It was a cold, unyielding reality that offered no solace. The figure, the one who had led them here, the one who had whispered the cryptic words of choice, remained silent, its presence now a faint glow in the background, like a distant star. It had stopped speaking, leaving the group to their own devices, to confront whatever it was that awaited them. The strange figure, or whatever it truly was, had fulfilled its purpose. It had shown them the path. Now, it was up to them to walk it. "Do you ever wonder if we made the right choice?" Alex's voice was soft, almost inaudible, yet it carried the weight of his doubt. Lila turned to look at him. His face, illuminated by the orb's distant glow, was filled with the same uncertainty that had plagued them all since the beginning. "What if we were never meant to know any of this?" he continued, his words filled with the kind of vulnerability they hadn't seen from him before. "What if we're in over our heads?" Lila felt a surge of empathy for him. She had asked herself the same questions countless times since the figure had first spoken, but she couldn't find an answer. The truth they had glimpsed had shattered the safe, comfortable world they once knew. Now, as they approached the final moment, the choice to step forward seemed less like a decision and more like an inevitability. "What if we can't go back?" Jake's voice, too, broke the silence. His words hung in the air, and Lila knew they all shared the same fear. There was no returning to the way things were. Whatever they would become after this, it would be something entirely different from what they had been. The orb before them pulsed more brightly, and suddenly, the world around them seemed to crack open, like a veil being lifted from their eyes. The landscape, once so alien and incomprehensible, began to shift once more. Now, it was not just a swirl of colors, but a chaotic, living tapestry of images, fragments of history, flashes of moments that should never have been, and glimpses into alternate realities they had never imagined. A sound, strange, yet deeply familiar, began to resonate in the air. It was not a voice, not words, but a kind of deep vibration, something that moved through their bones and resonated with the very core of their being. It felt like a summons, a call to action, but no one spoke. They simply stood, mesmerized, as the images and sounds continued to swirl around them. They were no longer just observers. They were now part of the cosmic fabric, woven into the very structure of existence. In the midst of the overwhelming spectacle, Lila felt a sudden clarity. She understood now that the knowledge they had been given was not meant to be understood by human minds. It was far too vast, too infinite for that. The universe they had glimpsed was not meant to comfort or enlighten them in the way they had expected. It was a harsh truth, one that stripped away the illusion of control, the illusion that humanity was the center of it all. The truth was that they were small, insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But that wasn't the terrifying part. The terrifying part was realizing that this knowledge didn't make them insignificant in the eyes of the universe. They were part of a far larger, far older, and far more complex mechanism, one that had no place for human understanding. And yet, in this moment, Lila also felt a strange sense of peace. Despite the fear, despite the overwhelming nature of everything they had learned, she realized that they had made the right choice. The path forward was not easy, and it would not be kind, but it was theirs to walk. They were not simply witnesses anymore. They were participants in something much larger, something that transcended them, something that they would never fully grasp, but that they were bound to experience nonetheless. The orb pulsed one final time, brighter than ever before, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to stretch and bend. Time itself twisted into a loop, and Lila felt herself falling. Not physically, but through time and space, through the very fabric of existence. The visions became clearer, sharper, and in the final moment before everything shattered, before everything merged into a single point of light, Lila understood. This was not an end, but a beginning. As the light consumed them, the group vanished into the fabric of the cosmos, and with them, the knowledge they had witnessed, the decision they had made, and the truth that could never be fully comprehended. They had crossed the boundary that separated humanity from the infinite unknown, and in doing so, they had become something more than they had ever been, something that would live on in the echoes of the universe itself. The end was not the end. It was simply the start of an eternal journey, one that no one, least of all them, could ever hope to understand.